So for example, we can do, let's first create our constructor. And what should our constructor take into account? Yeah. Do you guys have any ideas of what the parameters will be for our student constructor? Yep, you both seem to be on the same track. So we're going to have a string. We'll just call it M for name. We can have an int like I for ID and an int GPA. But so, and then we can just set our name equals N, ID equals I, or GPA equals G. But then there's the case that some students might be created with the same ID. So I don't know if you guys have covered this yet, but can either of you think of a way that we can make sure that no two students have the same ID? If you can't think of anything, or if you don't think you've covered that yet, feel free to let us know in the comments. Oh, okay. So yeah, if you want a variable to be unique across different objects, what we can do instead is we can't compare it because we don't have access in this class to every instance of students that have been created. But one thing we can do is we can set up what's called a static variable. Static variables have the keyword static in them. But we type private since we don't want anyone else to access it. Like ID setter. What static variables are is if a variable is static, that means there's only one instance of it in the whole program. So for example, there will only ever be one instance of ID setter, and no one else can create a variable ID setter. So instead of setting ID based off of what the user inputs, we can set our ID equal to our ID setter. And then we can increment ID setter every time it is used. So therefore, no two students will have access to the same ID. And let me remove this. The static variables, because they don't belong to any instance of the class, they actually have to come above it.
Sorry, can you explain what private static does?
Yeah, give me a sec. Oops, just kidding. Okay. So what the keyword static means is that static means kind of like independent. So our ID setter variable is independent of any program. It's not tied to any object. So for example, ID setter is not tied to any specific student object, but rather it's kind of owned by all student objects and therefore can be used to set each individual student's ID. So here, if we want to go see an example of this, I'm going to go ahead into our driver and create some student objects. So let's do student news, and we'll have Helen, and then the second variable GPA. So let's say 4.0. How about that? So what did I do wrong? String our GPA should be double, not an int. hopefully this example will help explain it. So if we were to have numerous students equals new, let's say this one is Amanda, and we'll say Amanda has a 4.0 as well. And then we can have student Jack. Let's say Jack has a 3.8. So now if we try to get all student A, student B, and student C's IDs, we'll notice that Helen, Amanda, and Jack will all three have 3 different student IDs because of our ID setter. So let me go ahead. So once we set the ID, we'll go ahead and print it. So let's first, we'll also print out the name so we know who we're dealing with. Let me add some lines so this becomes easier to read. So here what we're going to do is we're going to, every time we create a new student, we're going to set their name equal to their instance variable name, print out their name, set their ID to ID setter, which should give them a unique student ID, print out their ID, set their GPA equal to whatever the parameter was passed in, and increment our ID setter so no 2 students can have the same ID. So if we go ahead and run our student driver where we created 3 student objects, we'll see that, let me pull this up. Helen was created first and given the ID of 1. Amanda was created second, given an ID of 2. And Jack was created third and given an ID of 3. So if we were to write this constructor differently without the use of the static variable, and let's say we have int I to represent our ID, and ID, let's say, is equal to I. Let's comment this out. Then you could have all the students have the same ID, and there would be no issues. But if all students have the same ID, that could get a little bit confusing, especially if school systems like login information is based off of our ID. And that's why we might want to use a static variable instead to make sure that this can't happen. Does that make sense on when you would want to use a static variable as well as how they're implemented? Okay, cool. So then let me go ahead and reset it. And then it looks like our constructor is done and we can go on to the next part of the project. With classes, something you also might want, to have some mutator methods. So let's say somewhere along the line, someone's GPA changes. How would you guys go about writing a mutator method for the GPA variable? Feel free to type the method signature in the comments. Yeah, so Helen, that's exactly what the purpose of it. So yeah, we're gonna make a setter So should this be a public or private method? Okay. Have you guys covered private methods? Yeah, so ideally, all your methods should be private, but if you make a method private, then other classes can't have access to it. So this would actually be a public method so that when other programs want to edit the GPA, they actually have the ability to do so. And then they will have to go through our class as opposed to changing and having access to the instance variable itself. And that's one reason why we will use these functions or methods as opposed to making our instance variables public. So yeah, this would be a public. It doesn't really need a return type. We can name it change GPA. And we can take in whatever the new GPA is. And then in here, to write the code for our GPA mutator method, also known as the setter method. So let's just be familiar with both terms. Here, let me. We can just set our old GPA equal to our new GPA. And then that will make the change. So does that make sense on how to write setters? And these can be done for all of our instance variables. But again, one we would not want to use it for is our ID, because we do want to make sure all of our IDs are independent and original for all of our objects. But does that make sense as to how we wrote our setter? Okay, cool. Another type of method we might want with our student objects is we might want a getter. And what a getter does is it just returns the value since the other classes don't have access to it. So if we were going to write a getter for an ID associated with a specific object, this has to be a public method because other objects don't have access to our private instance variables. And here, let's say we want to return an ID number. It would return whatever type our instance variable is, in this case, an int. And we can call it get ID. And it doesn't necessarily need to take into account anything. In some cases, let's say you had an array, you could pass in like the person you wanted. Let's say if we had an array of students and you wanted the name, let's say, associated with student number 4, then you could do that way and maybe pass in a variable. But in our case, we're only dealing with one student in question, so we really don't need any parameters. Do you guys remember how to return, what the return statement should be for this getter? Yeah, that's exactly the concept we were looking for, except for here we were looking for ID. So we can just do return ID. And because our ID is an instance variable, we'll have access to it throughout the whole course of this program. So now we've written our constructor, our mutator, as well as our getter. So other programs should be able to freely change our GPA, get our ID number, and without having access to any of our private information directly. So those are the 3 types of methods you'll see with classes. And so that just fulfilled our first initiative for today of creating a student class. And now, does anyone have any questions about our student class before we go on to objectives 2, 3, and 4? Awesome. So before we created these 3 students, and but now let's try to create an array of students. So for the easiest way to create an array of students would be probably first to create an array ourselves, and then set like the spots of the array equal to the students. So, do you guys remember how to initialize a blank array? If you think you know, please type it in the comments, and if you're not sure, write that as well.
Sorry, Jack, is it for GPA or for name?
Yeah, so we're going to try to create an array here of type student. So yeah, Amanda, that's exactly what we are looking for. Oh yeah, and if you guys ever have any questions, if I'm not wording something clearly, please feel free to ask. So yeah, we're going to make it, and instead of students, it's going to be of type student. This student array, and we can call it students equals new. So because we created a student class, we can now have objects of type student, and that's why our array is allowed to be of type student. So what this is it's essentially a collection of the students we made earlier. And then we can go ahead and we can add all of our students from before to our array. So do either of you remember what index will our array start at? Yep, that's exactly right. So the first spot in the array will be index 0. So we can set students 0 equal to A, students equal to B, and students 2 equal to C. So now we have a new array of students, and in A we'll find Helen with her student ID of 1, her GPA of 4.0. In section 2 we'll have Amanda with a GPA of 4.0, and her ID, as we saw earlier, was 2. And then in our spot number 2, which is actually our third spot in the array, we'll find Jack with a GPA of 3.8 and an ID of 3. So this therefore satisfies our number 2. And so now, does anyone have any questions before we move on to objective 3 here? Okay, awesome. So we need to now traverse the array and print out every student name and ID number. So there are different approaches we can take to this. If you guys were to see this problem on the AP test, what do you think you would do? How would you go about traversing our array of students and printing out every student's name and ID number. Yeah, so we would need a for loop. And so we can create a for loop, and we can either do a normal for loop or a for each loop, depending on whatever you prefer. Okay, if you want to do for each loops, we can do that. We'll just call our student current because that's the one we are dealing with. And we'll do it over our whole array of students. So currently, because all of our instance variables are labeled private, we don't have access to them. So as for getting access to all the information we need to print out, we can do one of two things. We can either create getters for all of this information, a getter for the name, a getter for the ID, or another option we have is to create a toString method. Have you guys covered toString methods yet in class? Okay. So yeah, Helen, we can do a review of these, and then Amanda, you can help me out along the way. So what a toString is, it allows you to print an object. So whenever you try to print an int, it prints right away. If you try to print a double, it just prints out that number. What's happening behind the scenes is a toString method is being called on those objects. And that just tells you what to print when you print an object. So if we come here now and try to back to our driver and we try to print out current, which is one of our students, it's just going to give you the location of the student in memory. So like here we have student at some random numbers and letters. That's just giving you the location in memory of our student. But sometimes when we won't print the object, we would like some more meaningful information. In our case, we want the name and the ID number. So what we can do is we can edit the toString method of each class, edit the default one, and therefore get some meaningful information. So Amanda, since you've already done toString methods, what would be the method signature of our toString method here? What is the method signature of the toString method? Sorry if that was a little confusing. Yeah, so like our other methods, the toString method is a public method, and it's actually going to return a string, since that ends up being what's printed, but then it's just called toString. It doesn't take into account any parameters, and the reason for that is because it's based off of information that the object itself already has access to. And the string that the toString method returns is going to be the string that ends up being printed when you try to print the object itself. So for us, let's say we want to print out the name. We can do our string that is returned. Or we can also call this result. And initially, it's going to start out as a blank string. And then we can edit our toReturn string to include all the information that we would like. So first, we wanted it to include the name. And then we can concatenate on our name variable. And then we can also add on to it our ID number. Again, because we are just adding, let's add a plus equals here to make sure it just equals whatever it was before. And the equals here is shorthand. It's essentially the same as doing to return equals to return name plus name. It's a way to save you the step of adding the to return plus, but either of them work. They both are acceptable means. And then at the end, we just need to return variable at the end of this function. Some other things to note when using toString is that because it's within the student class, it will have access to all of the instance variables. And then what it returns is just this whole string with the name and the ID. There might be cases when we want to break up our ID and our name, since right now they'll be printed back to back. And one way we can do this is by adding a new line at the end through the shortcut \n. So now what will be printed is name and then followed by ID on their separate lines. It's just a way to break up your code. You can also just do some spaces here as a way to like separate the name from the ID so they're not immediately back to back and that you have some room between them. But these again are just a little bit of add-ins which can help the readability of your output. And they're not actually necessary, but they can make your code look a little cleaner. So yeah, so now, Helen, did you have any questions about how the toString method works or why we would want to use it maybe? Yeah, the toString method simplifies the code and it changes what is outputted when you print out a specific object. So instead of it printing out where it is in memory, the toString method then causes when you print an object to be whatever you want it to be. So in our case, it's going to print out the name and the ID as opposed to printing out a memory location. You cannot see the actual toString method. Do you see this? Can you see the highlighted part right there? Or is that not showing up? Okay, yeah. The actual toString method itself, where it prints out the memory thing, is just like built into Java directly. So we actually do not get to see that ourselves. The process of what we just did is called overloading, and we'll cover that more in depth. I mean, it's called overriding, and we'll cover that more in depth in next week's webinar. Does that make sense? Okay. So now if we try to run this again, we'll notice that the information printed is actually going to be a lot neater than these memory locations. So here's when we start to print out our objects after all of them have been initialized. And so our name for the first one is Helen, followed by Helen's ID of 1. And then it does the same thing with Amanda and Jack. And then when we made our constructor, we had them print out the names and the IDs. So this allows us to double check that it is Helen 1, Amanda 2, Jack 3. And that's exactly what we saw when we printed our array. So therefore, we have finished our third objective. And does that make sense to all of you as to how we were able to do that? Awesome. So yeah, now we've covered this toString method as well as how to make our constructors, our mutators, and our setters. So for our fourth objective here, we're just going to try to find the average of all of the students' GPAs. So do either of you have a guess or a way that you would approach this problem yourselves? yeah, if you were to see problem 4 on the AP, what would you guys do first? Oh, you can't? I'm so sorry. But yeah, so wait, Amanda, can you see it now? Okay. Do
Like
you
some part of your screen is a little small.
a little small? Okay, here, let me try to zoom in. Does this help?
No. Can you like zoom out?
Zoom out? Okay, I don't know what's happening now. Give it a second.
I can't really see the right side of your screen. Oh, there we go.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay, so can everyone see everything now? Okay, cool. Yeah, again, I can't see what you guys can see, so if there are any issues like that, please just let me know. I'd love to help out. So yeah, Helen, you had exactly the right approach. So what we're going to try to do here is we're going to get all the GPA values, and then we're going to divide it by the length of our array. So here, let me go ahead and label this as, this is part 3. Over here was part 1. Oh no, this was part 2. And now we're moving on to part 4. So I know earlier you guys said you wanted to use a for each loop, but this time we're going to try to use just a normal for loop. So what should our iterator start at? What number? Yeah, that's exactly right. And should it go up to less than or equal to the length of our array? For I equals 0. So, okay. We actually do not want, if we're going to do array.length minus, ooh. Yeah, that's exactly right. We want students.length, and then we're just going to increment it by 1 each time. My bad. So again, the reason why it was just giving me an error there, if you caught that, is because arrays do not have a parentheses around the length. The length is instead just a direct attribute of the array. So while you might need to call .length with parentheses after it for strings, for arrays, it doesn't have those 2 parentheses at the end. So something else we will need is we will need to create a int total to keep track of our total. Why would we want to create our total outside the for loop as opposed to inside the for loop? Does anyone know? Yeah, that's exactly right. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make sure that our total is the sum of every GPA from here. And if we just created the total inside it, then our total will be reset over and over again. So because we need to get our GPAs and our GPAs are private, we first need to create a getter for our GPA. So let's create this real fast. It will look very similar to our ID setter or getter, where it is just returning the GPA and the ID. Is everyone with our GPA getter? Okay, so then we can just use this GPA getter for our method. So then we can add to our total whether the GPA of this student. So students I dot get GPA. And once this runs for all of our different students, we can print out our total divided by our students dot length. What type of variable will be printed in this statement? An int or a double? Amanda, what do you think? Double? Okay, so what type of variable? Wait, can everyone see it? Does that help now? Yeah, it's line 42. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on with my computer right now. But yeah, so what is total? What type of variable is it? Int. Good job. What about students.length? What type of variable is that? Yeah, so because we're doing an int divided by an int, one thing to keep in mind is this would then be integer division. So our result would also be an int. So if we were to run this code right now as it is, wait, can you see the results or is that also not working? How is total an integer? Good catch, Helen. Total should be a double. But if it was an integer for whatever reason, an int divided by an int will always be an int. So we would need to typecast this down here to a double. But because total is supposed to be a double, good catch, Helen, a double divided by an integer will return a double. So our whole result here will be a double. And we can add in a typecast anyway, just to be sure. Can everyone see the code? I just want to make sure. Okay. Is there a return statement? So the return statement was found in our setter or our getter method. So when we got our GPA, we returned what the GPA was.
In terms of when you said, can you see all of my code?
Wait, can you repeat that?
I just wanted to ask if there was like some more part to the code. Because we had that problem growing up in it. And I just wanted to make sure that was what you were typing.
Oh, yeah. So the problem with scrolling up and down, all I did to fix that was I had a bunch of enters. So hopefully you guys I can just like locate the code based off of the part of the screen you could see. So the line of code we're dealing with right now is line 42. Can you guys see that? Okay. And so that was a really good catch, Helen, that total was supposed to be a double up here on line 35. And so we don't need a return statement as in. Okay, let me try to reshare my screen. Maybe that's the easiest way to go about this. Okay, so that's the bottom of my head. How about now? Same thing. Interesting. Let me try this again. Oops. Okay, now it's not letting me do it at all. Okay. It is really big. Interesting. Is this making it smaller at all? Or does it not look like I'm doing anything?
You made it bigger.
It made it bigger. Okay. How about now? Is it hopefully a little smaller? Zooming in, but smaller screen. It's a little smaller. Okay. Okay. Is this helping at all?
That's very small.
Very small?
I think that's for the size. But it's just showing.
Now it's good?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. I have no idea why this is having so many issues today. I will look into this at the end of the webinar. But yeah, so hopefully you all can see line 42, right? What about lines 35 through 42? '28 through 40. Okay, perfect. Awesome. So yeah, now this will print out our result as a double, and it will take in the average of everything. And as we can see here, we got the answer 3.9333336, and that would be the average of our GPAs, 4.0, 4.0, and 3.8. Does that make sense? Okay. No worries, no worries. Here, can you see the output? Hopefully, I'm highlighting it. Okay, awesome. Well, that's the end of the example, luckily. Does anyone have any questions as to how we found the average?
I do have a question. You casted double to the response to whole average. I thought when you have a double divided by an integer, a double anyways.
Yes, it would be a double anyways. I made the double cast before you let us know that total was accidentally set to an integer. So this cast is actually not needed. So we could delete it entirely and it would still work. So let me move up my console so you guys can now see this. If we run this again, we'll get the same result. And that was with the code without the cast. Does that make more sense? Yeah, I don't know why that's happening, but luckily for me, the example is now over, and I'm gonna pass it over to Seben, who's gonna lead us through some practice questions. And while she's working on that, I'll try to fix my screen. So 7, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. So I sent you guys the link to the and so try those because we don't have too much time. You guys should try doing them backwards in backwards order. I'll probably give you guys maybe like 10 minutes and then I'll go over them. So even if you don't finish, that's fine. You can still submit it so I can look at the answers and go over them with you guys. I'll give you guys like 2 more minutes and then go over them. But don't worry if you don't finish because we really didn't give you guys enough time today. And if you always have questions, you can always email us like separately or sign up for one-on-one tutoring. So I'll give you guys like 1 more minute. Okay, so I know only one of you have finished. But I will quickly go over these with you. So let's actually start from the last question. Can you guys see my screen? Is the whole screen showing from like line number 88 to 114? Okay. Yes. Okay. So if you look at the last question, we gave you a person class which has first name, middle name, and last name as the instance variables or your fields. And then we have a constructor that initializes, that initializes, hold on. Sorry, my bad. Okay. That initializes first, middle, and last name. And then we have getters for the first, middle, and last name. So what you want to do is, so we gave you a piece of code that initializes a person. Oh, sorry, my computer keeps doing that. So we pass in Sana as the first name, Sophia as the second name, and Maria as the last name. So what we want to do is to make it like easier or like to, simpler to read, I just call the getter method on the first, middle, and last name, and then I stored it in these variables called first name, middle name, and last name. And then what I did was I did substring from 0 to 1 from all of the names, and then I concatenated them by just adding the plus signs. You can do that with the strings. And then I just use the string to lowercase method, which converts all the first letters of the names into lowercase. So this was just like to help you guys use like the getters method to have access to the fields of a class. And you can also use like char add. I know I use substring method, but I know for one of you guys use char add. You guys can also use that. So that is good. Do you guys have any questions on this question? Number 4. Okay, good. Let's go over number 3. So For number 3, this is just a simple review question for your arrays. And basically all you have to do to get the first element is just get your index and then your last element and then check if they both equal to 6. So this is a very simple question. I think both of you guys got it. I'm just reviewing your answers real quick. Yeah, you don't have to use like a for loop for everything. You can just access the first element and the last element by using the index like 0 and then getting the last index by just doing length minus 1. Any questions on this one? Yeah, you really didn't have to use all that, but that is good. Okay. And then for number 2, basically all you have to do for this one was you see that you created a die object here, and then we have our last value stored here as our private integer. Oh, sorry, my computer keeps saying that. So what you want to do is you just want to randomly generate numbers from 1 to 6. So this is also a review of the math.random method from the math class. And all you had to do was take the upper bound minus lower bound plus 1 and then plus the lower bound. So we want our numbers from 1 to 6. So 6 minus 1 is 5 plus 1, which is just 6 here. And then we want our numbers to start from 1. So we add a 1 here. And then basically we save this random number into our instance variable called last value, and then we just return this one. So if in our loop, in our for loop right here, we're just rolling our dice 10 times, and then we're just printing out the random rolled number 10 times, and which gets stored in the last value instance variable. Any questions on this one? Okay, good. And then our number 1. So this was just practicing creating class. It's just very simple class. And I think both of you guys did, or at least like one of you guys submitted the answer. I think you did fine. But I'll just go over my answer with you guys. So first we have our person class here. And then we have our 3 fields, which are the name, string name, int age, and string phone number. So this is very similar to the student class that Jack went over with you guys. So for our constructor, we only want to initialize the name of a person. So we only pass in, or we only have one parameter here. So we set our name variable equal to the parameter that was passed in. And then for the getters, all you have to do was just create a method called getName, getAge, and getPhoneNumber, and return our fields. Just make sure that when you create these methods right here, make sure your types are correct and they correspond to your fields. So for our name, we return we have a string getter method because we're returning a string, and then we have int for getAge, and we have string for getPhoneNumber. And then we have, for the setter methods, we take in a parameter, and then we set our field equal to the parameter. Oh, whoops. So this should be, because we're getting a number, we're passing in a number, and we want to set the age, which is an integer. And then I didn't ask you guys for a toString method, but basically, sorry. So basically, you just want to return the information of a person. I want to return all the name, age, and phone number of the person. So all I had to do was just concatenate those strings together. So when we test for these in main, we would create a person P1, and then we create the object by using the keyword new, and then we pass in a name. So in our constructor, we get the name in, and then we set the name of the person, P1 as Sana. And then we do the same thing for P2. And then we can set the age of person 1 and person 2 by using the setters. And then you can also print out the specific values using the getters method. And then once you do call system.out.println line of an object, this triggers the toString method. So you would get the value of, or you would get the name, space, age, space, phone number of person 1 or person 2. Any question on this class? Or any other questions? Okay, so I know we took a lot of your time today. If you have like any other questions, not just on this, but like anything that you're learning at school, or anything else that we haven't gone over, we're always available. So just like shoot us an email, or just you can always schedule one-on-one tutoring. Yes, Jack sent the link to the calendar. You can always click on that and then just sign up for one-on-one tutoring for whoever is available. So if you guys don't have any other questions, yes. Yes. So for now, you guys can just like email us personally or to the Rise Up CS account. Yeah, the public account. Okay. Sounds good. No problem. Have a great week. We will probably have our next webinar, I think, next Sunday. Yes. Okay. You too.